Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 14. This week's guest is San Diego artist Pastilla. I met Pastilla recently at the Mass Attack event at the San Diego Art Institute, and after being introduced to her and talking to her about her work, I knew that I was going to want to continue the conversation, and that's coming up in just a minute. So, I don't know about you, but the past week has been a bit of a roller coaster for me, and I know for a lot of people, really. In the span of, 3 days? On Thursday, Prince died, and on Saturday, Beyonce released her Lemonade album, and moving from mourning to celebration that fast was, I don't know, kind of jarring. I'm still sort of processing all of that, caught up in it, and not really sure where I am. But I thought now might be as good a time as any to talk a little bit about something I've been mulling over for a while, and it has to do with participation and art that's not for me. And so I'm not really talking about Prince and Beyonce, or at least I'm not just talking about them, though certainly there are huge parts of both of their work that, even though I like it and I'm even moved by it, there's parts that I just can't access, and I never will. And that's certainly been on my mind a lot the past couple of days. Like listening to Beyonce just roaring and Don't Hurt Yourself. There's stuff in there that just pulls the emotions right out of me, stuff I feel in my guts. But then there's stuff, too, that I just don't have the life experience to ever really know, at least not the way she knows it, the way black women know it. But I'm not just talking about them. I'm thinking about all kinds of art that isn't really for me. It wasn't made with me in mind, and whether or not I hear something in it that I can relate to, that's just kind of tangential. The person speaking isn't speaking to me. I was thinking about this a few months ago, actually, when I was looking at this photographer, Natalie Crick's Instagram, which I really enjoy, but is very clearly speaking to young women and not men in their late 30s. Or another example is the writer Jenny Zhang, who I've been reading a lot so far this year. She writes these essays and poems that just rock my socks off, and bits and pieces of them seem like they're taken right out of my brain, right out of the inside of my life, but they're not. They're taken from her life. And although I can relate to some of it, especially the things specific to being an Asian American, she's not really talking to me at all. And so I find myself wondering about what the limits are for how I can participate in art that's not for me. And I think maybe that's going to get some people's hackles up. People will say, hey, I can like whatever I like. But for me, I'm not really thinking in terms of being allowed to read a poem or listen to a piece of music or just to appreciate something. It's not about what I'm allowed to do. It's about how can I engage with this in a way that isn't harming anyone, that isn't crowding anyone else out or trying to make it about me or take something away from someone else who it is supposed to be for. There's an interview that Jenny Zhang did with another writer, Charlotte Shane. It was on Medium, and I'll put a link on the show notes. It was called "There's No Spectrum of Nuance for Why People Might Expose Themselves." It was a really interesting conversation all over, and one of the parts that stuck with me was when the two of them were talking about how they write about sex and they write about their bodies, and that oftentimes at a reading or something there will be these creepy dudes there who get really into the more prurient aspects and make assumptions about them and how that's gross and uncomfortable. So then I was thinking about that a lot, how as a man, just my presence in some spaces is going to put some people off, how they're not going to feel completely safe if I'm there. And I know a lot of guys are going to complain about how they're not molesters or rapists and say not all men or whatever, but that's really beside the point, because the point is that this work is made by a woman speaking to other women. So if me being there makes some of those women unable to enjoy the work, then that's me interfering with the purpose of the work. I haven't really settled on what the right boundaries are or what they should be. And of course, I'm pretty sure I'm sure it's all dependent on the specific context of each particular instance. I know that I can like whatever I like, and that if the work is out there for the public to consume, it's not wrong for me to consume it. But feeling out the limits of participation. That's tricky. Anyway, I guess this might be sort of a touchy subject for some people, and I don't know exactly what I'm getting into with this, but if you've got any comments or questions, you can email me at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com, and I'll definitely read them. So back to today's guest. Pastilla is currently based here in San Diego, but as we talked about during our conversation, she's been in a lot of places, being originally from Tijuana and later moving to Pittsburgh, PA, before she eventually came here to San Diego. And that experience of coming to the U.S. as the spouse of an international student, that is what fueled the piece that she was showing at SDAI when I met her. I've included an image of that drawing on the episode page, as well as a link in the show notes to the image on her own site. It's called Metamorfosis de Kafka F2. She has a really interesting drawing style. The way she uses color and line, particularly line, to fill space. It's really interesting. So you should definitely check out her site for some more examples. And actually, interestingly enough, I didn't know this when we first met, but she also incorporates photography into her practice, so that was something we have in common. Anyway, it's a really good conversation, so let's jump right in. Here we go. I was wondering if you could remind me the title of that piece that you were showing at Mass Attack.
The title of the work was The Metamorphosis of Kafka F2.
Yeah. And when we met, a friend of mine, Amanda, had pulled me over and said, "You gotta talk to this woman because I think you'll really have a good conversation." And it turned out she was really right. And the thing that she said particularly was how having the statement or the story behind that piece really, really deepened the experience of the emotional resonance of how the two of us, she and I, were able to understand it. And I found that was really true as well. And hearing you talk about it was, it was pretty moving. And so I thought that might be a good place to start, is talking about that piece that you were showing.
Yeah. So the piece itself, it's an abstract drawing.
Mm-hmm.
The mediums are gel pens, different types of pens, a bit of watercolor. It's very intricate visually, very detail-orientated. And most of the work that I do, including that work itself, most of the time actually, starts as a small doodle on a small piece of paper, which is not the piece itself, but it starts in essence from that,
mm-hmm.
which I consider to be the process, but also a bit of the way I was putting up with having to be in a particular type of state.
Mm-hmm.
In this case was being on the F2 visa
mm-hmm.
for the number of years that I was. The F2 visa is a dependent of a F1 visa, which is a student. So all students that come into the States marry and are bringing their wives to the States, bring them under an F2 visa,
mm-hmm.
which is a visa that allows the person to live in the States but not necessarily have a Social Security number, therefore not having the rights or the privilege that someone with the Social Security number have. The work itself is it starts as these fine lines that then morph into particular perhaps shapes, and I say perhaps because it's still very abstract, and that's the entire idea of it.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not a representational work because it demands time from people. It demands for people to stop for a moment and try to figure this out, which is where I think abstract art is very rewarding in itself. It's kind of this puzzle that it's impossible to put together. It takes forever to resolve, yet it won't ever really be resolved. And that's how the status itself feels. And that's what the work pretty much is. It's the constant weight, the constant need to resolve this status, to resolve this painting, to visually give it meaning without actually having a particular meaning for its own sake, but that can easily be interpreted by others by their own mind and experiences.
Yeah. And just, seeing that drawing, it was pen and ink, right? Pen and ink drawing? Yeah. The way that I was thinking about it some more since we first met, and thinking about how it all comes together. And the drawing is so meticulous. There's so, like, it really, you're filling like almost every single space on the paper, and with line, with color. And there's so much like pent up energy to it, like that that being able to hear this story, the story behind it, you really get the sense of like this sort of frustration that comes from being in this in-between status. I think you were telling me before that one of the experiences you had, it was like you were on hold.
Yes.
Yeah.
An eternal hold. At least that's what it felt like. Yes, it's definitely frustration, but it was also a method of, I guess, it became meditation. Mm-hmm. It became a way of trance, to draw every little line, to have the time, to not lose my mind. Mm-hmm. And it was a way to get that energy out rather than having it, I don't know, so destruct myself in a way.
Yeah.
So I would say that even to this time with other works, I kind of go into this trance of just producing lines and straight lines, and they're very small, yet it might seem endless when it's not. There were occasions where I had a bit of obsessive compulsiveness with them, that I would count the lines and make sure that the lines were the number of lines that I needed for the space. Mm-hmm. And make sure that those lines were, to me, making sense with another pattern that I was creating by the number and thickness of the line. Mm-hmm. So it became I became too invested in spaces, and that's when I started actually using watercolor to break away from that, because I felt that watercolor will allow me to move in many directions by filling more space, yet making it more free and less obsessive. Mm-hmm. So I used the watercolor to break from that, and I realized that I had so many rules and laws against what I could do and what I couldn't do that I just decided to break from them. Mm-hmm. And that I wasn't going to just, in that reality, continue respecting rules in the sense that I was creating art, that I needed to do, break free from it. So I incorporated the watercolor, which has a different visual effect. And to me, that was my way of being a bit of a rebel when it came in the arts, right? Mixing things that are traditionally perhaps not always put together in the sense of the work.
I mean, it's interesting because, you know, that thing that you said about it being a meditation, that there's something what I find, what I do as a photographer tends to be very, you don't really spend a lot of time on any one image as a photographer. And when you take the image, obviously it's like just an instant. Mm-hmm. And even when I go back to edit it, because at least with the kind of photography that I do, I'm not spending a lot of time compositing things together, or, I spend just, I might spend an hour on one photograph, and that would be an extremely long time for me. And when I'm writing, I'll spend a long time on it, but the process of it is not very physical. Mm-hmm. So it's all just sort of thinking about it. But, recently I've started working on doing things that are more with my hands, like making books, handmade books. And I find it is the same sort of thing that you were just saying, where I can sort of get in a groove, once I've sort of worked the process a little bit and I kind of know where I'm going, then it becomes a little more mechanical, and my mind can wander, and I can have sort of just this flowing sort of state.
Yes.
It is very meditative, and it's not something that as an artist I had really experienced very much before. But it's like what a way to like, if you're in a situation that's frustrating, that's when you would need that.
Yes.
The most.
Definitely. And it is interesting to me what you just mentioned about photography. My background is in communications. So I did my bachelor degree in communications, and I've always been drawing, but I never showed it until I actually moved to Pittsburgh, where I spent those 7 years. While in TJ, I did practice photography, and most of the photography that I did was for a cultural newspaper that at the time needed a photographer willing to go to downtown Tijuana late at night to cover all of these cultural events that were happening. Mm-hmm. I was 25, 26, I can't remember exactly, but I don't want to, I don't know. But it's this girl being sent to downtown Tijuana late at night, 10 p.m., dressed all in black with photography gear on her. There comes a time where I realized that it wasn't just enough wanting to do the photograph, but actually having to do a little bit of anthropology work. So meeting people, realizing that I didn't only need to do the work, but I also needed to make sure that I was going to be safe. Mm-hmm. And the one way that I found that I would be able to do that was by getting to know all of the local vendors. And whenever something sneaky or something that wasn't right was occurring, they would give me the heads up, and that was time to go. Mm-hmm. But I felt very much part of society as I was doing the photography. I felt that I was being witness to something. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the drawing itself, most of the time I'm at home, sitting at my desk, just in my mind, mm-hmm. not really knowing what's going on out in the world. But the sense of creating something that no one else created, that no one else had access to, it's something completely different. It's meditation, but by the end of it, it's a different type of accomplishment, I guess. Mm-hmm. If I take a mug and we have 5 photographers, we can all take different types of photographs of the same mug, but it will still be a mug. Mm-hmm. If I draw a line a particular way and I decide to add colors in a particular direction or saturation or even a semi-recognizable shape, that is mine and mine only. And maybe that's where the entire artist ego comes into mind. But yes, you do feel a little bit like a god when you finish a piece and you say, no one else created this. Mm-hmm. Whether people will like it, I don't know, but I do, firstly. And I think you have to be truthful to yourself, and that's where the abstract work takes place. That it feels very mine, but I also feel privileged whenever I get the opportunity to show it. Mm-hmm. And having people trying to figure it out and not knowing what it is, that feeling of being lost for a moment is what the meditation state is a little bit like. When you're drawing or painting or going through that process, you realize that you haven't been thinking on anything else but those lines. You don't know what's going out there. You don't really care. You don't really care if something else is occurring on the next room. You're there for your own sake and for that sake of that one particular piece. So it is, I think, I personally enjoy the photography in that sense, that I can feel part of. So whenever I feel that I've been in the room for so long, I just need to get out with the camera, and then I can have a little bit of proof of what I saw. And even when I'm outside with the camera, I don't necessarily feel that I now have to interact to know what's happening, because people don't realize they're so comfortable taking photographs, for example, selfies or whatnot, and just living life, that it's interesting to see how people stop paying attention around them. And once you do take the time to pay attention around them, I always picture people as if they were characters in a animated film, for example. And once we take that into consideration, it's interesting how far more interesting we are than we think.
Yeah. I
don't know if it might sound, maybe I'm just sorry.
No, not at all. I think, there's
immersed.
a thing about being out in the world that with some types of photography, like the studio photographer doesn't do that in the same way. But like, I'm not a studio photographer, and there is definitely there's an energy to being out in the world, and that's one of the things about photography that I really love is how it teaches you to look at things, and it that you find that you pay attention to stuff that maybe you wouldn't have before, and that other people don't pay attention to. And I think that's sort of what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. But then the energy that you get from, like, there's an energy to being out in the world and capturing things. There's a different energy that you can get from deeply focusing on something, and that is something for me that I've been, I think for my practice has been kind of is something that I've been coming to realizing that there's something else, like different modes of making things, different energies that I would like to be able to get my hands around a little more than I have. And what's exciting about hearing the way that you approached these pieces, drawings and paintings, that there's, like, everybody seems like has their own approach, everybody has, and I've talked to a couple different painters for the show so far, and the way they work is very different from the way I work, but also different from how each other work, and that's one of the things that I think is so interesting. Like, there's, when I look at other people's work, there's sometimes you look at it and you go, wow, I could do that. That's something that I understand how that could come about. And then there's other times when you feel like I have no idea where that came from. And one of the things that's been really interesting for me is talking to people who work in ways that are really different from how I work, that seeing that process starts to sort of demystify it a little bit and make it more make the process of it a little more accessible, that's really exciting to me. And your work, especially, you know, that piece that you were showing at the Art Institute for that event, that it just makes it made sense to me, you know, especially after talking to you about it. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you feel. When there's that piece of recognition, you just said, you know, that the experience of the viewer being lost and not really knowing what it is they're seeing, mm-hmm. that's part of the experience you want to impart. But there's also like that moment once the understanding sort of blooms and there's recognition and connection, like I got to figure that's a big part of it too. Yeah. Yes.
And I guess one of the subjects that all of the pieces that are the pen and ink works share is that they are all basically, they have different titles, but basically they're all about the order of chaos. Mm. And chaos doesn't necessarily have to be bad. Mm-hmm. I actually think that we need a little bit of chaos. When everything's too perfect, we can, I don't know, I think we would go insane. We need to be, we are by nature problem solvers. Mm-hmm. And feeling a little bit lost while seeing something beautiful, it's almost as if I was trying to say, it's okay. It's okay to be lost for a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think we should, but we all basically share that. We just don't realize it right away. Mm-hmm. And that itself, the feeling of wanting to resolve it, looking at the chaos and realizing that, the work is about chaos. Mm-hmm. Is automatically, it's the work itself. That feeling is the work. That is the work. It's not that the piece itself needs to be something in particular, but it's actually what you're feeling, the mm-hmm. sensation. That itself is the work.
Yeah. I think that's you know, people who don't necessarily spend time engaging with art, or especially visual art, especially from the aspect of making it, that there's this idea that like things being conceptual, or things like, I think people tend to engage with a thing as a thing, you know, mm-hmm. like a piece of paper with color and line on it is mm-hmm. a thing.
It's a thing.
A sculpture is a thing. A photograph is a thing, or a screen is a thing anyway. But like that the art actually comes from the experience of it rather than the thing. I feel like when I first figured that out, that was like, it was like the lights coming on, you know? That was definitely, you know, it was, I don't know if I want to overuse the word. It was a revelation, you know? And particularly with abstract work, I think it can be difficult for people to get their arms around sometimes. Especially if you don't have any kind of, you know, training or schooling in art. It can feel a little impenetrable sometimes. Mm-hmm. But at on some level you still have a reaction, even if it's not easy to puzzle out at the beginning. And that's where the magic is.
I don't know. I completely agree. I think there's also this idea that art is extremely complicated. Mm. So by having that idea that art has to be complicated, it's easy to overanalyze it mm-hmm. and not let it flow. Mm-hmm. And by overanalyzing it and not letting art flow, as the person that's experiencing that is when you come into trouble as the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just allow your first impression to be the guidance towards the appreciation, then you should be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not also supposed to like every piece of work in a museum. I'm going to make an analogy. I'm not sure if it's good enough, but it's just, the way I see it is that when you're tuning into AM, FM radio, you're going through everything. Just because it's in the radio, it doesn't mean that you have to like every single station.
Right.
You look for what fits you.
Right. Right.
I don't know, classical, jazz, rock, whatever. And then you walk into a museum. In my mind, that's how it's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
You should like look for the right tune, and it shouldn't be complicated, and it should be enjoyable.
Yeah, yeah. I think though, there's like a thing. I remember I was having a discussion once. There's a writer that I spoke to a few episodes ago. His name's Daniel Abraham, and he's a science fiction author that I really enjoy his work. But also I like the way he thinks about stuff. We were having this discussion once about accessibility in art, like whether obscurity in art, what that's about, what does it do? And the thing that I remember thinking was that there's art that's complicated or not complicated, that art doesn't need to be complicated in order for it to be valuable, that the way you engage with it doesn't need to be really deep or thought out in order for the experience to be meaningful to you. But then that there are also experiences that you can't have easily. Like there are some experiences that you have to kind of work for just in order to have the experience at all, whether or not that's meaningful to you. Like it might be to some people and it might be not be to other people, that kind of experience, but that it can't be had without spending time and without sort of working for it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And where I guess like I think there's a thing here where like you shouldn't make something complicated or assume something is complicated, whether you're making something or seeing something. It shouldn't be complicated just for the sake of being complicated. But sometimes it's okay for stuff to be complicated too.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I guess that I think what we should be careful with is that as the viewer, we shouldn't expect for everything to be complicated.
Yeah.
And you're not expected to also sit throughout that video projection that lasts 30 minutes to be able to experience it.
Right.
But I think it's wrong to judge early on art and expect that everything has to be complex in the experience, I mean.
Right, right.
In the process of experiencing the art. But to first have a glance and then start to interpret from there and start to understand it. But by putting a tag on all art as this complex method of experiencing art, it's already altering what the experience itself and not being really fair to the piece that we're about to experience.
Yeah.
So having that in mind, I think that would be key to be able to experience anything, not just the piece itself, but anything for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does put a lot of people off, the assumption that it's going to be hard, or that it might be
or that they don't have this particular ability to experience art.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a shame, too, because there's a lot of, I think, there's a lot of people that tend to be very critical of the arts in general because of that assumption. And it makes it harder to, it makes it harder to support an artistic community when that's the assumption, when there's sort of that hostility towards it from the audience. But two, I mean, it's a shame because it's art can be such an enriching thing, and for people not to even seek it out at all just because they think it might be too complicated it's a shame.
Yeah, it is, but it's also a shame that I feel that I'm simplifying the idea of art as an experience too much, but I think that why not also look to be educated about art?
Mm-hmm.
If we don't understand something, doesn't mean that it's automatically out of our ability to understand it, but maybe it means that we should just look a little bit harder into it.
Yeah.
And why not?
Yeah. And especially at a thing like where we met, like you could just ask because the person is right there.
You can just ask. And it's interesting because there was such a huge variety of work, and some of the mediums were similar, but they were very different types of work. But even by talking to one artist, it would open your mind to think about another piece or the next piece that's coming after that one, and they see it in a different way with different eyes.
Yeah.
So it is education in that sense also. It's not just getting to know a particular artist, and that's that. It's learning to see differently.
Yeah.
It was a big opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a lot of fun at that evening.
Yeah.
Got to see a lot of stuff there. I'm hoping the next time it comes into town, I'll be able to participate as more than just an audience member. But we'll see. I mean, I don't know how these things actually work. But yeah, for the listeners, it was like 50 artists from San Diego and 50 from Los Angeles. They all brought their work, one piece, and it was just sort of like a big, almost like a party.
Yeah.
And no worrying about sales, no worrying about any of that stuff. You could swap pieces if you wanted to, but it was basically just there to meet people and talk about their work, and that was fantastic.
It was. I mean, I guess that it's normally the intention of every opening, really, like to go to an opening, see the work, but also have a chance to meet other artists, because the people that are going to be at any opening pretty much are going to be art lovers, art makers, art whatever.
Yeah.
And just taking that opportunity to meet other artists, it's huge. And I personally feel that I need that a lot right now.
Yeah.
I really am a community type of person, and I really enjoy meeting other artists that are invested in their communities. And I mean, that's how you need to go on about opportunities also, right? Like, meet other people, you start to realize how things are done.
Yeah. I try to get to one opening a month. For a long time, I wasn't going at all, which is kind of what happens because I got 3 kids. So,
Yeah.
The first year or so, you like every time the first year or so is usually a little tricky, and you can't really find the time. And my youngest is almost 2 now, so we're sort of finally starting to get to the point where I feel like I'm okay and we're okay, and each of us can sort of go out. Sometimes, my wife will go out and do her thing in the evenings, and we can manage it now. But yeah, getting out to the openings. I mean, I like going to see art just not as an event, like going to a museum. on an off day or going to a gallery just on a regular day is cool. Seeing the art is cool, but there is that aspect of, being at the opening and meeting people and having the opportunity to talk to the artists is it's always very eye-opening. And one of the things I've always been impressed with is, you hear this thing about artists being elitist or snobby or whatever, that they don't, there's this impression of artists being inscrutable and not wanting to have to explain their work to people, and I think that there definitely are people like that, but I think it's been really gratifying. You go out to these events, and even people that are pretty high profile are usually really nice about it. They're really usually just happy to have the opportunity to have people interested in their work, and so they're usually very generous with their time and very open to having the conversations, and that's been something really, really great for me. I definitely know what you mean about community, about being able to find that community. I feel like it's been a common theme in the people I've been talking to, especially the ones I've been talking to in San Diego, where we all kind of feel like we're sort of cut off. And actually, that even just goes back to the thing before we started recording, you were saying that it was difficult for you being here. So before you lived in San Diego, you lived in Pittsburgh?
Yes.
And having to have a car to go places, and not being able to walk places or take public transportation, you were saying it was difficult for you.
It was, because it seems that everything the day has to be in a way planned out when you have to drive everywhere. And while I was in Pittsburgh, at least initially for 2.5 years approximately, all I had was my bicycle. Put a big basket on the back. That's pretty much how I did everything. Grocery shopping, going to the gallery, going to the museum, going to the public art events, doing photography, documenting for other artists. And I just really enjoyed being able to ride the bicycle and seeing something interesting, stopping right away. And realizing that I was on my way home at 12 o'clock and getting home at 12 midnight because I stopped like 5 times. And I did not have to think about it twice. It was very easy to do. Having to drive in San Diego to all these locations, they are pretty far away. They're pretty far now. It's just that it's very convenient to have so many ways to access these locations by freeway, I guess, that we don't feel. There comes a moment when we don't think it's far because it takes a short period of time to get there, but in fact it is.
Yeah.
And it's far. You have to plan your trip, and it's not easy to just stop anywhere.
Yeah.
I guess.
There's something about the sort of, sprawling, the way that cities around here are so spread out. I don't know what it's like in other, I don't know what it's like in I don't know, Chicago, or what it's like in, I don't know, Lincoln, Nebraska, but at least here, what I was saying to you before the show, I grew up in California, but not this part of California, and the place where I lived was a very small sort of rural town, and stuff was far apart, but the town didn't have very much population, so you kind of knew, you did have a connection with people, even if you couldn't necessarily walk to somebody else's house or walk to the grocery store. You still knew everybody in town. I think my town that I grew up in might have had maybe 3,000-4,000 people. So I didn't know everybody, but my mom might have known everybody. And then hearing, people in more denser places like San Francisco, or it sounds like Pittsburgh, you walk more, so you get more of a sense of your community and connection that way. But then in a place like Southern California, it can be a little isolating because there are too many people to know a lot of them, but they're too spread out to have that local feeling. So it's tough.
Yes. One of the things that I experienced in Pittsburgh when it came to the way the city was laid out and the community itself was that it was very practical to start projects, especially community-based art projects, because of that closeness. Because if they were having a particular workshop to start off a particular project, whatever project it was easy for people to get there if they had cars or bicycles or didn't have a car to get there. It was very easy. So it was relatively easy in that sense to meet other artists and to start things because of that. To meet people that had the same interests that you did. And I'm sure that there's many people that share interests anywhere, but just having that closeness when it came to the way the city was laid out, I think is a factor in the way artists work together. And a good example of that is all of these warehouses in LA that are now filled with artist studios. Well, not now, they've been filled with artist studios forever.
Yeah.
It's LA. But the same thing is happening now in the old downtown Tijuana area after the wave of violence that occurred throughout the peak was 2008. A lot of people stopped crossing the border, especially after 9/11. Therefore, there was a loss of tourism in the area. So many of the areas that catered to tourists had closed down, especially in these like underground corridors, which are now being filled in by artists. Among other people in the arts. I don't know, you'll walk through these underground corridors and you'll find the gallery next to the cello class, next to the independent coffee shop, next to the independent art designer or furniture builder, next to the beer maker, next to another gallery, and then next to a theater in tiny spaces. So having that physical gathering of creative people, I think is extremely important for the development of more creative people and the quality of that of the art that is being produced or the culture that's being developed for that matter. I consider that very important, and I'm sure that it's developing here in San Diego as well, but it's just that it's been a bit more difficult to identify these spaces for me, or that group. I don't know. It's been hard.
Yeah, for me too.
Yeah.
I think, as I've, especially even just through this show, met more people, more local people, that I've started to see more of that kind of thing happening here. And I think also part of it is that I've lived in San Diego now for a long time. I've been here, I think, 11 years, which for San Diego is a long time. It seems like a lot of people aren't from here who live here. But in that time, like I feel like I've seen more stuff, whether it's because I just became aware of it or because it's new, but like the arts district in Barrio Logan seems like kind of have that kind of quality to it to some degree. I know in the East Village there's this place called Space for Art where it's sort of a little artist colony, and it's very cool. I've never actually been to Tijuana before, which I guess is, living here as long as I have is maybe a little inexcusable, but I keep hearing about the art scene there and how it's really taking off over the past few years. That seems really interesting, and it's so close that it seems like the kind of thing I should check out. I just haven't gotten around to it.
Well, maybe we can take a trip.
Maybe.
I would advise you to not go by yourself.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Just because things work a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And even though things are not what they used to be, it doesn't mean that you don't need to take a certain precautions. But when you're not familiar with how the city works.
Sure.
I mean, I think about like other experiences. I don't know if I would just visit other places that I've never been before by myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever place it might be.
Yeah. So you lived there. You
Yes.
lived in Pittsburgh. Now you live here. There's a lot of moving around. Like.
Oh, and that's just places that I live because, okay, so I moved from Tijuana to Pittsburgh, and while in Pittsburgh, the reason why I moved to Pittsburgh was because my husband was doing a PhD program in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And along with the program, he also did a lot of research, field research. And in one occasion, we moved to Mexico, first Mexico City, and then we did about 17 cities within 2 months.
Wow.
We came back. He decided to change his subject, which is totally fine, and I support because I think it's awesome.
Yeah.
But he later had to do extensive field work, and that was for about a year. So we left Pittsburgh for about a year. And we went to about, 6-7 cities in which we lived throughout that time. Mm. So making art was very hard.
Yeah, I bet.
It was very, very hard. But it was a great opportunity to do photography. Mm. And that's what I did. So yeah, it's been a lot of moving around.
Yeah.
A lot. But it has also given great opportunities to document or I don't know, feel like a part of something.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know like the going back to that first piece that we were talking about, pen and ink drawings, where you were describing this feeling of being on an F2 visa being a very stifling experience, and it's the kind of thing that would make it would really reinforce all the time that like having so few opportunities and rights that are afforded to you under a visa like that really would just constantly be reinforcing to you that you are an outsider.
Yes.
It seems like having, and so it's really obvious where that frustration that's in the work stems from. But then having that experience too of moving around so much seems like it would be hard to get your feet under you to really feel like, to not feel like an outsider if you're not in any one place for very long.
Yes, the way I saw it was that I was already an outsider, even if I spent, even throughout those 2.5 years in Pittsburgh, right, that I didn't really move much, that it was stable. I felt an outsider there. I felt an outsider always.
Yeah.
I've been feeling like an outsider forever.
Yeah.
But at least, I guess that at least by moving and constantly traveling, that I had a reason to be an outsider and to use that to create rather than having it define me completely.
Yeah.
And that has been tough because that pretty much what that status was saying at the time was you should stay home.
Yeah.
And what else? You can have children.
Yeah.
And you can volunteer, which I did a lot of. And I'm so thankful for being able at least to volunteer, right?
Yeah.
Because so much was taken away, but I was able to be part of something. And I was not ready to let that define me.
Yeah.
So at least by traveling, I would use that freedom or interpret that as freedom of not being able to do so many other things, and say, okay, I can do this particular activity and I can create from them.
Yeah.
Rather than let it define me.
Yeah.
Which is still tough even today.
It is. It's tough, I think, in a lot of ways it's tough for I don't know what the right way to put this is, but in this country it's tough for minority people to not feel like an outsider, even if it is where you're from a lot of times. I know that is something for me that's been sort of a recurring theme of my whole life, that my family's been in this country, parts of my family have been in this country for a very long time, for like 120, 130 years. And so we have roots that go back a long way. This is where we're from, but, it's still, there are ways that you get made to feel like you don't really belong here, even though you've never been anywhere else. So I think that's something that a lot of us struggle with. And if we're lucky enough, then we get to at least channel that sort of frustration into making art. But I guess that's one small privilege of the artistic inclination, is that at least you get to turn that frustration into something positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things I remember talking to with you about on that day that we met was that I was a bit concerned with how I was addressing this subject, because I didn't want to talk for an entire community.
Yeah.
And I that is not my intention at all, because I do understand that it varies from conditions, circumstances, and personal experience from person to person. But this was my experience.
Yeah.
And I felt that because it was mine, I can do with it whatever I wanted.
Yeah.
So why not?
Yeah.
Why not create art with it?
Yeah.
If I was successful or not, I don't know. I mean, I'm still trying and working on it. But am I going to keep trying? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why not?
I think that thing that you said, not wanting to speak for a whole community, I think that's something a lot of us deal with. About, I know, like, even my brother-in-law is from Brazil, and a lot of times when we go to parties or whatever, he'll come back and he'll be frustrated because everybody will ask him these questions like, what are people in Brazil like, or what do Brazilians think about this issue or that issue, or like what do Brazilians like about like the World Cup, or about like, I don't know, there's like a political situation down there with the president right now, and like they'll ask him questions as though he can respond for all of Brazil, which is a gigantic country that's not even like, it's not uniform, like different parts. It's like anywhere, right? Big country, you got different people in different parts of it that don't feel the same way about stuff, and he goes through that. He gets very frustrated. I think that the thing that you're saying about it being your experience, though, that's something that you can, like, nobody can ever take that away from you. But I don't know, I mean, we all go through that. There's like a sort of almost this weird like guilt almost about feeling like you're,
yes, you don't want to, I don't know, you don't want to take something from someone,
mm-hmm.
and that is their opinion, their insight.
So for the second segment, I always ask my guests to bring a topic of their own, and the topic that you chose was how artists affect their community. Is that right?
Yeah.
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 So why don't you tell me what you're thinking?
Well, I think I chose this subject because even though I do not do community-based art,
Mm-hmm.
I have participated in it in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that was mainly through volunteering, because that was one of the things that I was able to do, and I really considered that for a few years almost a career. The fact that I can volunteer and bring something to the development of a particular work. And I've noticed how important it was for areas that were neglected almost to have artists come into the area and decide that they wanted to do something there. First of all, because normally it was very affordable for artists to be there to build studios, but to also consider that was perhaps an area that needed to be noticeable again, and that it would be welcoming in most cases, I guess. So the artists, most of the projects in which I had an opportunity to participate were either anywhere from putting up exhibitions, from very large public work that was displayed, created by the community. I mean, having an artist developed, creating the project itself, but in theory, but actually depending on the community itself for the development of it. And at least from my experience, what I started to notice is that when people realize that they can do something together, especially through the arts, because it's almost like a love letter. It became like a love letter to the community, saying, this is where we live. We love our community. It might not be what it can be yet, but it will. And we haven't given up.
Yeah.
And I think that was extremely important. It is extremely important for communities.
Yeah.
Especially in areas that need to realize that they can define themselves and not let others define their community.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a powerful thing, the ability to tell your own story instead of have to accept the story that's told about you. And it's something that it's like one of the things about art that I think about, that, you know, we all go along and we're sort of trapped on the inside of our own heads, and we don't really know what anybody else thinks or feels. And it's really only through communication that we're able to get a glimpse. And then that's really what art is communication. And so for communities that are, you know, underprivileged communities, that having that power to put your own narrative out there, to direct that story is a very powerful thing. And whether it affects greater changes, whether like having an art project necessarily leads to something more, even if it doesn't, it's still a powerful thing just to feel like you're being represented in that. Definitely.
Yeah, having a say on it rather than having someone else come in and say, oh, this is this. Because people move, right? I mean, people move constantly, but for someone that has been there through generations and has seen changes, good and bad.
Yeah.
Right? I realized that many people with who I worked, young and older, were people that embraced their history, no matter what the history was, And by recognizing that history, I think they were ready to build a new one, a new history, well, a new presence or a new definition, and based on that other definition of the area itself, which was not seen, even if it was not all grade, it was seen as, okay, this is us. This combination of occurrences is us, and we can build or become stronger because of it.
Yeah, and often the people that are actually in the communities, those are really the only ones that even know what the story even is, for real.
Yeah.
And I know, like, the neighborhood where I live in Mira Mesa, and I mean, that's a neighborhood that has a certain reputation that is kind of deserved and kind of not deserved. I've been actually thinking for a while now that I'd like to do a photographic sort of documentary project on Mira Mesa, because the longer I've lived there, the more interesting I find it. But it has this reputation of being sort of, run down and not a nice neighborhood. Not that it's necessarily, like, dangerous there, but just that, it has a reputation for being a bunch of, like, I don't know, poor Filipino people that have cars in their front yards up on blocks, like, and that there are parts of San Diego where I can go, and if I say I live in Mira Mesa, people will kind of like look at you a little like, why do you live in Mira Mesa? And that really gets me really it just makes me really irritable, when people do that, especially because, it's one of those things, like I started off, I didn't grow up there, but I've lived there for almost 11 years now. And even in that time, watching the neighborhood grow and change, and, like even something, just talking about the arts, there's just a little project with local artists and even some high school students decorating the electrical boxes that up and down the street. And it's these little things of engagement that really show you that there is so much more going on in that community than what people outside give it credit for. And that's really, like, empowering people to tell that story about their own community is just so important,
Yeah. Yeah, and it's as you said, it's interesting how people react when you tell them where you're living or where you're from. In my case, whenever I told people I'm from Tijuana, the first thing that people think were, I don't know, $1.50 beer, crazy bars, among many other
people
ideas of it. And like, I mean, I'm sure there's there's a lot of that still.
Sure,
of course. I mean, the city itself catered to pretty much, I guess, a lot. I think what I'm trying to say is that the city itself catered at some point to young Americans, right? They weren't able to drink here and would drink back in TJ because the legal age is 18 then, not 21. And then, if we go back into even further history, provision, right? You can't have a drink here, but you can cross the border and have as many as you want, among other things. But, if people have this reaction, and it has to do with the fact that they're not familiar with it because they don't go, but also there's media doesn't really help.
Right. And even if they do go, many of them just go to that one part where the bars are, and they don't see how people actually live there. Yes.
And while I was in Pittsburgh, we were talking about food, and one of the things that we were talking about with a bunch of friends was lobster. So first thing that came to my mind was Puerto Nuevo down in Baja. In my mind, best lobster you can have. I invited one of my friends who had never been in Mexico before in her life, had no experience. And I was very clear to just say, well, TJ is kind of a limbo. It's not quite one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a lot of contrast, and I can promise you contrast. And we spent 3 days here in San Diego and 3 days in Tijuana. And we did a lot of contrast searching
Mm-hmm.
in all sense of the word. And one of the things that she said right before leaving was that that she realized that it was much more, but that she was impressed by the number of very negative images that she had seen on Google
Mm-hmm.
before visiting, just out of curiosity. And yeah, the first thing you do when you're searching, you put the city and then you put a search, but also images. And the first images that came were these horrible images of shootings and drugs and whatnot. And she came, TJ, and this, people have to live. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I'm just saying that it is a vibrant city.
Mm-hmm.
It is a city. It's full of people that have jobs, that have dreams, that have fears, that have all emotions that you have had in your life, but in a different
Mm-hmm.
format, I guess.
Yeah, that's it reminds me of this. There's this TED Talk that there's this Nigerian author, and I can never remember exactly what her name is. I think it's Chimamanda Adichie. I think that's how you say her name. I'm probably wrong, but she had she's a novelist, and from what I understand, her books are really great. I've got one on my nightstand that I haven't started reading yet, but it's going to come up soon. But she gave this TED Talk that was all about what she calls the danger of a single story, and she talked about not just the way that, like, when she came to college in the U.S. from Nigeria, how, like, you know, people would ask her about, like, her tribal music, and, like, she grew up listening to Mariah Carey, or, you know, people would tell her that the stories that she wrote weren't believable because they weren't presenting Africans as, like, a, you know, tribal poverty-stricken people, that they were just, you know, people with regular lives. And that made her really irritated, but also that she herself, you know, when she was growing up, she had a certain story about, like, the family that they cleaned their house, that she had one particular idea about that family and what their lives were like, and then her eyes were open when she actually visited their family. And, you know, and it's the same thing that you're talking about with Tijuana. There's, like, I think a lot of people are going to have just that one story, whether it's the party thing or the drug violence, and that will be either informed by they've only seen one small part of it, or they haven't seen any of it at all. Mm-hmm. And that's a very dangerous thing, because it denies the possibility of people who live there just being people, you know? It's very frustrating. Yeah,
it is. One of the things, it's so weird that you just mentioned that, but to me, because I think about all of these experiences that I had when I moved, and Pittsburgh is not the most diversity when it comes to Latino population. Mm-hmm. I think it's right now. I mean, I might be mistaken, but I think it's about 3.5, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. 3.5%.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was weird, because some people would say, well, you don't look like a Mexican. You don't look this, expecting, I don't know, some iconic image
mm-hmm.
to walk in the door. Or having this ideas about what I should be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, some of them were accurate, some of them are not, but I never felt, I have to clarify that I never felt offended. I just because of the way that they were brought up, or the
Mm-hmm.
questions, they were more like questions rather than just opinions. So there
Mm-hmm.
was opinion, but then it would come with the question. So I
Mhm.
felt like, okay, you have an idea, but you're curious. It's not that you're being judgmental.
Mm-hmm.
And that I really appreciated. And I started to realize that I also was not very familiar with other cultures, but that did not mean that I was not interested. It was just that I had not been exposed to,
Mm-hmm.
right, like to other particular cultures. And one of them being that while growing up in Tijuana, there comes this moment in which you think that the U.S. is San Diego,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or is this cities next to the borders that I have experienced, when
Mhm.
in fact it's more complex. It's exactly the same in Mexico. You have different Mexicos throughout
Mm-hmm.
the levels because they have been affected in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, just being open-minded.
Yeah. It's even the same thing that happens, like people here, even thinking about a place like Pittsburgh, there's like a particular narrative of Pittsburgh,
Mm-hmm.
of that part of Pennsylvania, that like, I think if people are going to think of Pittsburgh from here, they're going to think of like a depressed steel town and everybody out of work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only thing going on there, is that like everything is just awful there all the time, and like that kind of thing.
Okay.
And that's clearly not actually the case, that there are people there making their lives, and people, there's more than just that one story, even though that certainly that the story of the steel mills in Pittsburgh is part of the story there, but it's not the only part of the story. You know, it's you can almost not really escape it. You know, anybody seems like you can't help coming from a particular point of view, but once you know, hopefully once you start having more experiences, whether it's traveling or meeting people or even just through art, that it can help open you up to it.
Yeah, by being curious.
Yeah.
Rather than having to feel like you have to know everything, and
Mm-hmm.
to feel as if you know everything, then you have to judge it.
Mm-hmm.
When it's best to just ask or go look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably as good a place as any to end the conversation, at least the recorded part. But I really appreciate you letting me come to your house and talk with you.
No, I appreciate you wanting to talk to me. I hope I did not disappoint.
No. Why do people always say that?
Oh my
It's
God,
almost
it's
every single person has said something like that.
Well, it's I don't know. As you mentioned it before, you've been interviewing what now, 14?
You're number 14, yeah.
14 people.
Yeah,
I'm sure the others have felt the same way that I feel, that you're put in a spotlight, and that
it's getting to do this is my pleasure, and every person that I've talked to, you included, has been it's been a really great experience for me and really fun. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so that was my conversation with Pastilla. I think that thing we talked about engaging with your community, that's something that's really important, and it's something that we could all do more of. So maybe take this as an opportunity. See how you can get involved in the arts or otherwise. As for the show, if you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. You can also find me on Twitter @ChannelOpenPod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you'd like to support the show, the easiest way to do that is to leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher, and that helps make it easier for new listeners to find it. You can also subscribe via your favorite podcast app so you don't miss any new episodes. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next week, I'll be talking to photographer Carrie Elizabeth Thompson. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.